Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could teach the gullible to never be so comfortable with lies they eat like comfort food? To disregard the bogus claims and pseudoscientific claims. Can you imagine just how much indeed the world would change? No more political predators playing on the populace, but ilkas and plots to shift and kill metropolis. No more villains with the title in the Bible, holding phony temper Bibles like the stuff they teach is vital. Imagine it was normal to have to prove a claim you make. And folks really feel ashamed expressing content that was fake. It's not to say we never make mistakes, it's just to say we go out of our way to show the evidence it takes.
Remain skeptical while you travel the road, the reason stay strapped. We're logic and fast. That's what it is, yo. Keep reality intact to help the truth grow. Question every claim, especially the ones you believe in. Remain skeptical while you travel the road, the reason.
Hi, welcome to Road to Reason, the Skeptic's Guide to the 21st Century. I'm your host, Kay Terzak, and this is our co-host,
Brendan McAuliffe.
You can always reach us, but with our Facebook channel, Facebook page, if you want to come and take a look at what shows we're doing in the future or comment on our shows. That would be on our just Road to Reason, our Facebook page. You can always watch us live on Sundays on Ustream at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Channel 36 if you live in the Fairfax County area. And all of our shows are put up on YouTube within a week of airing if you want to take a look at us, Road to Reason TV. Today we're going to be talking about cults and cult behavior and what it's like to leave the fold. Cults can be a scary word, and any religious organization described with this word is looked upon with suspicion. And it kind of begs the question why so many people actually get involved in cults. So we're going to be discussing that today. In the meantime, we're going to discuss a couple news items. First news item?
All right, so there's a man named Joseph, I want to pronounce his name right, Erdem. He's a teacher in Sweden. He petitioned his local church group to get a plot of land to be used as a gravesite. And so his plan is to make it a gravesite free of any religious or nationalistic symbols or anything like that. So it seems to be he wants to make it so that people can have on them what they want, but not kind of attack anyone's sensitivities, especially because it's a gravesite. So people, anytime you're there, you're going to be grieving, you're going to be emotional. Mm-hmm. He wants to kind of keep it light and free. And the thing is, it was owned by the parishes, by his local parish. But what ended up happening was they're now maintaining it and just taking care of it. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't really see anything necessarily wrong with having this separate area, mm-hmm. but I don't think it should become kind of like the norm. Like, I don't see any reason to kind of further any divide between atheists or theists or anything like that, because it just kind of seems to be this us versus them mentality that mm-hmm. we don't really need anymore. Mm-hmm. And as we evolve kind of emotionally as groups and stuff like that, we need to have more space for each other.
I think it's very interesting that, something as religious, death itself has a huge hold on religion. Religion is a lot about how people cope with death. So it's very interesting to me to see something come about that's deliberately atheist, and I think they've been deliberately calling it an atheist burial site. Yeah. And to me, it's something rubs me the wrong way about deliberately saying that you're not allowed to have religious or nationalistic symbols in your gravesite. I can see why somebody might want that, but to me it's just kind of petty saying, well, yeah. I don't want my secular, non-religious gravestone right next to this cross here. To me it seems a little bit petty, I guess you could say. Yeah, and it does have to do with this kind of idea of reverence after death mm-hmm. that is so heavily held onto by religion. And I mean, I'm not to say atheists don't mourn at funerals, mm-hmm. But it's just there's a more sacred aspect towards death. Yeah. So in other news, I did want to bring up something that doesn't necessarily have a direct relation to atheism and skepticism, but as minority groups within our country who advocate for good journalism for obvious reasons, we want to have one, good skepticism about things that are happening in our world, and two, we want to, uplift the journalists around the world who don't have the ability to go out and speak out about their religious governments. So on that note, it's very important that we have journalists who are able to speak about things that they want to, especially when it comes to the little guy. So last month, an American broadcast journalist, Amy Goodman, who's known for her work as a syndicated columnist and investigative reporter, and she's known for standing for human rights, she was issued a warrant for her arrest and with her involvement in the pipeline protests over in Dakota.
The original charges were dropped, though, right? And then they brought
Yes.
upon her riot charges.
Well, she was originally charged for trespassing,
Yes,
but as a member of the press, she was there specifically to cover the events that were happening. And I've seen the video.
Yeah.
And in the video, she very clearly does not participate. And I know that line can be crossed at times, but it doesn't seem to me that she's participating in this or trying to incite a riot. Rather, a lot of people are saying that the reason why she is being prosecuted this way is because she is showing the protesters were pepper sprayed and attacked by dogs and certain things, and a lot of people had a negative opinion of that, and so that's why she was prosecuted. So she did actually have her have that dropped.
Yeah, no, and it was really interesting to see because I was really interested in the story. She was brought up on like trespassing charges, and then they dropped it when people started freaking out, and then they brought up rioting charges, which were even just more ridiculous. They seem to kind of want to play into the idea that they're the big guy picking on the little guy. And it seems very strange that they would up the charges. Luckily, they were dropped later, but I have a feeling a couple people will be losing their jobs.
And it's very, very important, in my opinion, that we make sure that all journalists, especially journalists who are trying to get the story of the smaller guy, are able to get their story out without being persecuted by a larger entity that is threatened by that journalism. For instance, when we want to have a story about somebody being abused by a religious organization in the United States or elsewhere, we want to make sure that that story gets heard without the journalists involved being persecuted, which happens in a lot of countries where their governments are highly influenced by their religion, especially Muslim countries nowadays. That's why I personally cover a lot of journalistic topics, because over in the Muslim world, that's a huge issue where journalists will legitimately be killed for their opinions, and all they're really saying is that we would like religious freedom, we would like LGBT freedom, we would like to have a secular government, and those opinions are controversial. And I think any time a journalist is being persecuted for covering something that doesn't necessarily jive correctly or go well with somebody who has power, who has the power of the media, I think that they should definitely be protected, even if I don't agree. And I have some things to say about the pipeline that, but it doesn't matter whether I agree or not. It matters whether or not she was acting with journalistic integrity and giving the story as well as she could.
Because the story always from the very beginning comes across as the big guy picking on the little guy. The people in power saying we don't want people to know about what's going on, and so we end up hearing about the suppression because of the suppression. Actually, it's the wonderful thing I think about the internet is that it's bringing about these ideas of once someone deliberately tries to cover something up, more people see it, more people find it, more people look at it, because that's what's interesting, that's what's kind of tantalizing at the moment. And I'm glad stories like these come forth because it allows people to kind of come up and say no more.
And just to anybody who actually looks into this and thinks whatever your opinion is on the pipeline issue, it would be really great if you went and actually looked at the video and asked yourself whether or not she herself was participating in these riots and deserved to be included in prosecution against it. So so that's my opinion on that piece.
Sounds good. Yeah. No. Do you have anything else you wanted to cover?
At this time, I think that is all. We are going to be discussing, cults in a minute, and we have a couple different, recent and not so recent news items in regards to that. Just to reiterate, if you ever want to come and watch us, you can watch us on Ustream on Sundays at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and Channel 36 if you're in the area. And we always encourage participation with our shows. So if you wanted to call in today and talk about your story, if you've ever been involved in a cult, whether it's a workplace cult, such as Amway, or if it's something along the lines of like a religious cult, or I've heard cults revolving around sports and things like that, that would be great if you could give us a call. All right. We're going to
One of the goals of an atheist community is to provide support for those who find themselves without faith in light of mounting evidence against unfounded beliefs. Organizations with this goal range from skeptic groups to humanist service meetups to support groups for those who may have lost a community through their deconversion. In response to this, Recovering from Religion, an organization that seeks to support those who have left their faith, has recently launched the Hotline Project. This is not a deconversion hotline. The motive behind the project is to support a growing population of people who have left their faith and need to construct their identities around a new, beautiful reality. If you want more information, you can visit the Recovering from Religion website at recoveringfromreligion.org.
Good. Homemade noodles. Oh. Marty, stop it. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. It reminds me, I've been thinking maybe we should try a new form of birth control. I heard about this one, it's called the IUD, intrauterine device. Or we could try the patch on your arm. Actually, I think that one goes in your butt.
Bedsider.org has birth control information and a lot more. And it's...
What do you think then? Arm or the butt?
There's a lot of tree branches and dry brush over here. We should probably move the bonfire over there.
I'm guessing Smokey liked that idea.
This is Richard Dawkins. Doing commercials is unfamiliar territory for me, but I'm inviting you to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, on Fairfax Public Access every Sunday. Each week, the hosts tackle wishful thinking, religion, pseudoscience, and the harm they cause, with a combination of facts, humor, and community involvement. They challenge believers to defend their faith and give you, the skeptic, a voice. With live call-ins for viewers and streaming on the World Wide Web, there's never a dull moment. Don't wait. Look at them now on Facebook and YouTube, and remember to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, or there'll be hell to pay.
Hi, welcome back to Road to Reason, Skeptic's Guide to the 21st Century. Just in case you weren't with us from the beginning, my name is Kayla Turzak. I'm your host, and this is...
My name is Brendan McCullough.
Today we're going to be discussing cults, and specifically leaving cults and the kind of damage that it does to people when they do leave cults. I really wanted to discuss this specifically because I was involved in a milder cult called the International Churches of Christ, and I wanted to go over a couple things that I had noticed within my own experience with the church. So just as a little background to the church itself, it actually came and broke off in the 1960s from the original mainline Church of Christ, and which actually was considered a cult in some instances because of their beliefs about baptism and conversion. But basically in the 1960s, a man named Kit McKean broke off from that church because he believed that they were lukewarm, and he mostly centered his ministry around young people in college campuses. And they quickly grew, and at one point back in the 1990s, it was one of the fastest growing churches in the world, and it gained a lot of attention because of that. Now, back in the early 2000s, they gained attention again because of a huge controversial with the way that their church was structured and some of the manipulative tactics that they were using. And although my experience with it in 2009 was a lot milder, the church itself had become a lot milder because of the controversy that happened in 2002, in the early 2000s. It still had some of that cult, that cult feel to it, which I had noticed, but I didn't actually, I didn't actually respond to. Like, people had pointed certain things out to me. So after I got out of that environment, it kind of struck me that I actually was in a control group or a cult. And it was surprising to me because I don't consider myself an unintelligent person, and I don't consider myself the most gullible person. Although, you know, I think everybody has a tendency towards beliefs in certain things, and I think cults kind of take advantage of some of the way that our human psyche works and some of the faults in the human psyche.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my experience with that church. You know, the church itself. So that'll be a good reference point as we're talking about cults in general. But cults aren't always just religious. They can also be workplace cults.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I found, speaking of kind of that disassociation or that kind of detachment between being in that kind of cultish environment and looking at it from the outsider's view, it happens a lot. There's an article written by our friend Bill Donahue of the Catholic League, and he was writing about workplace cults. And the idea of this workplace cult was they were mandatory seminars that the employees had to go to, or else they were they were being disciplined within the company. And it didn't matter what faith the person belonged to, but they would be brought into these mandatory seminars. There would be like incense burning, there would be prayers said. There's all these overtly religious activities being played out within this workplace. And Bill Donahue was outraged. He was infuriated by the fact that people were lighting incense, saying prayers, and standing in a building. And it's really interesting to see how this detachment works.
Yeah.
It's this kind of outside perspective that once you become so entrenched in an idea and so ingrained with it, it becomes normal.
Yeah, and I think that people don't really understand how that actually works with the human mind. I mean, people think, for instance, that cults are something that maybe crazy people get involved in, or something that very few people get involved in. But especially, there was some research done back in the 1980s that I had found some statistics on it. And I didn't find any recent, holistic studies on cult behavior in the United States. But according to Bird and Raymer in 1980s, 1/4 of all adults had at least a transient involvement with a new religion or a para-religious group. And that could have been classified as cults. And high school students especially, whose experience within like that kind of market has to be limited based on, their experience with the world, they had 1% to 3% of report belonging to cults or exhibiting cult-like behavior with their involvement in groups, such as sporting groups, religious groups, those types of things.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting because, you can look at a list of cult behaviors and you can see how that could be a bad behavior to exhibit. Like for instance, the group can be really preoccupied with creating new members. That's a real big tell for like a cult. Or maybe they're really preoccupied with making money. Or they kind of have this way, however they do, of discouraging dissent or doubt or any kind of questioning towards the group or the group leader.
Yeah, especially the leader point is the fact that there's this big central figurehead who kind of has this knowledge.
Yeah. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of these points are there. And I personally think that cults are kind of on a scale. Like, for instance, I personally use the word control group, like a group that controls. Because I don't think, like I said before, I was a part of the ICOC, and I wouldn't consider either of the church that I was involved in like a heavy Jonestown kind of I don't consider it as dangerous as Jonestown, and I don't consider it as crazy as Jehovah's Witnesses. You know, I would not consider that to be a really heavy cult. But some of the cult-like behavior that they exhibited qualifies them, in my opinion, as a cult. But cult is such a strong word, and especially when you're working with someone who's in that group, who's justified their involvement in the group, you know, you can really put them off by calling it that. So I like to say it's a control group, or a group that controls.
Exactly, because cults kind of turned in from like a documented word that's used only in like academic circles. It's turned into anyone who's fanatic about anything that belonged to a cult. Yeah. Like people were calling the cult of Walmart when they stood up every morning and did this like chant. They had this group chant to kind of get everyone
that is kind of
on
creepy,
the. It is a little weird. But as a business, you kind of understand if you just get your employees all kind of just energized and then you let them go, they'll be way more productive.
But that kind of opens the door for abuse when you have like certain ritualized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so where do you draw that line between a cult and an aggressive marketing strategy?
As I go through this list, you'll see that there are things on this list that are just normal things that a religion might do, or normal things that a sports group might do. And you know, one of the arguments or justifications for people who are in the cults are either the behavior exhibited is okay because it's actually not harming anybody, or it's a part of their doctrine, or it's okay because it's so mild that, you know, it's not really exactly that. And you see all these other churches and things, you know, that do kind of the same thing. So anything really can be called a cult. You know, there's a lot of defenses that you can have towards it, but there's just things like, you know, the leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, how they should act or feel. And members often have to get permission, you know, to date or to change jobs or to get married or to move to a different location. And, you know, sometimes they have to get prescriptions from their leaders about what they should wear, you know, and how they should discipline their children or form their families. And it really, to me, has less to do with, you know, what the group believes and more to do with how they believe it and how much control they have over their members. And it's very interesting to watch, like in my involvement with the cult that I was involved in, a lot of times, you know, we would pride ourselves on how we all came to the same conclusion separately. But in reality, we had this system of leadership that kind of forced you into a certain mindset. And it was, everybody had similar beliefs and ideas on the surface. And we prided ourselves on being unified like that, but we actually had a system of unification that had to do with not being allowed to think outside of that box. So you know, the idea of like a leaders dictating things can be so mild or so kind of underhanded that it's not even really seen or noticed by people. Yeah. So like some of these things are so easy to get around. Like you might have to be in the group for a year before you realize that some of these things are there. But by the time you're in that group for a year, you've already justified so many things.
It becomes normal. Like that's why it's kind of that sedation aspect of it. Once you get ingrained, once you get used to a system, it becomes normal. Like if you would gotten if you'd moved from Italy and you were used to driving on England, and you were used to driving on the one side of the road, it'd be weird to you coming here and driving on the one side of the road. But if you're in England, it seems normal. So it's this entirely like the Pope. You were talking about the leader, having a select leader dictating people's ways and mannerisms. That is, or at least definitely could be used to describe older popes. Yeah. But the Catholic Church isn't called a cult, at least by some.
Well, that's because it's more like socially acceptable to be a part of that group as opposed to.
Exactly. And so where do you think that kind of line gets drawn? Because there's a lot of people that call like Scientology a cult, but people say it's a genuine religion. I'm just interested in what you have to say about that?
I think it's a really hard line to like put there in the sand, because so many people have different experiences with, like, for instance, I know people who've left my church. You know, I'm involved in people's lives enough to where when they leave the church, they think to come to me. So I know about 5 or 6 people who've left the church for different reasons, and some of them legitimately never thought it was a cult, and some of them are just like, yeah, it was totally a control group, it was a cult, and I'm glad I got out of it. And these are people who had been there for years. You know, I was involved in this group for 5 years in different capacities in different churches. So, you know, people can, if they want to, dismiss my experience with it, but like it's hard because there's so many different people's experiences with the groups. You know, something that might have happened to one person might not have happened to the other, but unless you can show how it was like a systematic thing, you know, it's a little bit difficult to quote unquote prove. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like,
no,
for
I
instance,
completely get that.
there was something that happened that really tipped me off, and this happened after I left, or I heard about it after I left. My Bible Talk co-leader was having a really hard time when I was in the MoCo campus ministry. And having a hard time, he decided to break off his relationship with his girlfriend to work on his relationship with God. And you know, he just happened to have graduated from college, and he mentioned to our leader that he wanted to visit a mutual friend who was a part of the church in DC. Now, like I mentioned before, there are 2 churches that split after the early 2000s because of the leadership issues. The old leader, Kit McKean, broke off and said that we were being too lukewarm, like he did to the mainline Church of Christ in the 1960s. So he started his own church separate than the International Church of Christ, and he had one in DC at the time. So we called it Kip's Church. So a bunch of our friends went over there, and so this guy, my friend, went to that church to visit one time, and then he moved over to Northern Virginia. But he had talked to a leader about it beforehand, and the leader told him not to, that he would be, you know, spreading discord within the churches by doing this, because he would be supporting the wrong church. And so when my friend moved to Northern Virginia, he started going to the Nova Church, which was not Kip's church at all. He only visited Kip's church one time to visit another friend. It wasn't even to support that church. And you know, the church leader from MoCo called the church leader from Nova and told him that this guy was spreading dissent and trying to go to this other church. And they confronted him about it and asked him to leave the ministry for a couple of weeks to think about it, like as punishment for going to this church. And to me, being on the outside now, it's just so creepy that someone would go that far.
Yeah.
There were times, for instance, where when I was thinking about leaving because I was having doubts, my ministry leader looked me up online and confronted me about a meetup group that I had clicked yes, I wanted to go to. She had Googled me, you know, and it's just certain things where you're just all like, why are you involved in my life like that? There's no privacy.
Yeah,
you know, I didn't want to talk to her because I knew what her answer would be. And that was fine. You know, I could make my own decisions on that. But instead, she wanted to confront me and try to. And she had done some manipulative things too in the past. And it was just,
Yeah, it's the removal of the self-autonomy.
Yeah.
It's the empty you out so we can fill you back up. And so you were talking about the fact that you've known a couple people who leave from that church. Was there any kind of, because this is really interesting to me, is there any single thing that they kind of all said was, well, this was the reason, or was it kind of all unique to the individuals about what reasons made them leave? It
was pretty unique to the individual. One of my friends said that he had doubts too about like the existence of God, and you know, he did say that he had seen some manipulation within the leadership that he just found really, really sad and disappointing, and he just could not believe that was there all along, and that he had not noticed it.
Just not seen it.
Well, you can't see something when you believe so strongly in something.
Yeah.
It's very easy to dismiss, you know, consistent child molestation in the Catholic Church if you're a practicing Catholic who really believes that the Pope and the Catholic Church are of God. It's very easy to justify negative things. So when you see these behaviors, like, for example, the group has a polarized us versus them mentality. which causes conflict with the wider world. It was very easy for me to see, I don't have a me versus them mentality towards the world. We love the world. We want the world to come and believe what we believe because we want to save them. But in reality, we had this savior complex towards the world, which was just as much a us versus them kind of mentality. There is no way that anyone in that church could keep up a friendship with me the same way because they were so involved in either converting people or doing the work of the church, discipling people within their church, that they could never, ever have a friendship with me because there's not enough room in their lives.
Yeah.
There's not enough room in their lives. So within the framework of how much work you're supposed to do to win the world for Christ, there wasn't enough time to have any real friendships with someone who's not interested in the message that they had. So your original question was.
So yeah, no. You answered it very well. So you were saying you had this kind of savior mentality, because that's another key, right? About talking the elitist mentality of like, if they only knew what we know.
Exactly. That idea of if they only knew what we knew, and if they only had the experiences that we had, or if they only knew these scriptures. So when someone rejects that, the only answer could be that they either didn't understand it correctly, or they're rejecting it for some nefarious reason, and that's usually sin. But I mean, it can be like that for any group. Any group that says that their way is the only way is a scary group, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's a very scary group. Or even like the only way for me. Like that inflexibility and that us versus them mentality is so nefarious, that's a good word, so detrimental to relationships with people on the outside, which it did. It hurt my relationship with my family because I was so focused on, I could not have a decent conversation with my mom because I always felt like she was going to hell because she didn't believe the right kind of Christianity that I did.
Interesting. And so it was just this, were you so overwhelmed with talking about saving her that it was just rough on everyone involved?
It was just more of like there was always a distance because we knew we believed in different things, and sometimes we would have conversations, but like
normally it would just be left unsaid.
There was that elephant in the room of, I don't believe that you're saved. And she was just like, didn't know how to handle that.
Yeah.
And it ended up pushing me away from my family, and we were encouraged to sacrifice time and energy and relationships with our family in order to be involved with this group.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So
I can't imagine what that's like.
And that, and there were manipulative practices too. We were told to be as sly as snakes but as innocent as doves, which is one of the charges that Jesus had for his disciples going out to spread the good news.
Yeah.
He said, you want to be sly as snakes, but you want to be innocent like doves. But that was justified for, like, for instance, we were told that there are certain things you don't want to teach someone at certain times. We would have this Bible study program that we went through, and you'd have to go through it in order to be a member of our church and saved.
Yeah, because it'd just be too much for a new person.
Yeah, so.
That's interesting, because that almost seems to be the very idea behind a cult. It's the fact that they know themselves that their ideas are so bizarre that it takes a while to kind of get accustomed to finally accepting this ultimate revelation of whatever's really going on in the universe.
And like for other people?
Yeah. You can't just, like, we couldn't just grab our camera guy in.
It has to be a very specific circumstances in which this happens. Usually, like, you can convert. We would say that somebody was open, or they were not open. And we were told that either someone was open by God or not open. And so we were taught how to find somebody who was open. And they usually were people who were in transitory periods of their lives.
Yep.
They were freshmen in college, or they had just broken up with a boyfriend, girlfriend, or they're having a really hard time with something like drugs or alcohol or depression or
family stuff, something like that.
Yeah, and we weren't deliberately told to go after these things, but we were taught in classes how to tell if someone's open. And usually it had to do with a need that they had that we felt that they could, we could place. We were always told that we needed to be brought to our knees before we were saved, before we could get to God. And I had prided myself in my own story because of how I felt like I was brought to my knees before I was brought to God. But in reality, I was in a desperate, needy kind of place, and which a lot of people, when they're transitioning from high school to freshman year, are very vulnerable. And so yeah, we were taught what kind of people would be open, quote unquote, and usually it was needy people.
It's interesting. So there wasn't any kind of formal writing in it, but
no.
Okay.
Like, you're not going to find formal writing on who you should go after, because we technically went after everybody, but we knew who would be open and not. You know what I mean? We dismiss people who would not be open, just like they're not ready to hear it right now, and they're not open to the gospel, or they're hard-hearted or prideful, or God hasn't brought them to their needs yet, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting because I was reading another article. It was by a guy in Scientific American. It's like an editorial piece, and he met with this like old, people would call him a cult leader. And it was this man who's named John Horgan, interviewed Andrew Cohen in the 90s. And he said, reading this article, he was just grasped by this guy's infinite charisma. It came across as this...
Was this the leader?
Yeah, it was the leader. It was this. He would stand up. He would wear this button-down shirt and talk like a self-help guru. But people were just overtaken by this guy's just magnanimousness, if that's a word. It's just this. This guy seemed to just send out waves of confidence, and I wonder if that's what it takes to start a cult. It's one guy with a large amount of the ability to sway people and enough ambition to kind of get it done. I didn't know if that's what you think, or do you feel...
I think that cults play on very basic needs that human beings have.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, there's a workplace cult called We Live. And if anybody wants to go and look up what We Work and We Live, they legitimately work and live in the same place. They work in the office area, and they walk over and they work and they go to their living places in these dorm-like buildings. And it's very popular over in Japan to live like that. That's Japan's, kind of going under when it comes to their baby making, production.
Yeah, they're having some population problems.
They're having some population problems. But We Live, if you look at it, you can see the ways in which this work and living environment fulfills their needs. There was a married couple, about to get married, who were just like, yeah, we're going to move right in here. We're going to have our own spot in this We Live area. And they worked with the people that they lived with, that they ate with, that they partied with. They all shared the same food, expenses, and everything. Like, it was a commune.
Yeah.
A working commune. And I could see how it filled a need within them that's very difficult to fulfill.
Okay.
It takes a lot of work to make sure that you're emotionally and you just emotionally fulfilled, not let alone like the physical needs that somebody might need, but that desire to be loved and to be a part of something and be a part of some group that really is good, just genuinely good. You don't have to think about whether or not the group is
doing the right thing.
Yeah, you don't have to think about things so deeply.
It makes it a lot easier.
Yeah,
right? Isn't that because
I think it's kind of the same need that we leave our parents, for instance, who fulfill that kind of need within us. We don't have to question, or at least as a little child, you don't have to question whether or not your mom, well, some people do, whether or not your mom's going to give you a hug and, do the best thing and the right thing for you. You go on vacation, you don't even think about the fact that your parents could kill you in a car accident. It's like that. And I think that cults kind of fill that same need. And so what do you think?
Yeah, well, that's when you were touching on this idea of, you don't have to think about it. You can just you relax. You don't have to worry about your side being maybe we're the bad guys.
Yeah.
'Cause that thought will creep into people all the time. You read one bad news article about your team, and all of a sudden you're like, maybe they weren't the best.
Maybe the United States isn't the best. Just kidding.
I was going to have a sports reference, but international politics is fine. And so I think it's that need to be a part of something that everybody wants. It's like that's why people join secular groups. It's why they join religious groups. It's why they join cultish religious groups, and that's why people join social clubs.
Do you think that people being more aware of that need would help with being aware of the dangers of being involved in it? Because anything can become a cult. Technically, anything can.
Oh yeah, we can start a cult right here, right?
I hope not. But anybody can start a group where the leadership induces a feeling of guilt in members in order to control them.
Oh yeah.
You just guilt them into not giving, like if they don't give enough money, you can just say, well, what about those poor dying kids that we're helping?
Yeah.
Like a volunteer cult, where legitimately you're doing good things for poor little kids, but you're being guilted into it. They're using, emotional and spiritual and mental manipulation to get you to do something that you wouldn't normally do on your own free goodwill.
Yeah, it's that molding the other person to fit their own needs.
Yeah. Why don't we go over your ex-girlfriend story? That was a very interesting story.
So my ex-girlfriend, I met her about partway through her transition with this cult. My girlfriend was kind of the shy type. She likes to go. She spends a lot of her time on internet message boards. She's really funny, smartest person I've ever met, hands down. But she met this guy online, and he began talking to her about what they should do together, and they came up with this, what they called the project, or actually it was the plan. They had the plan, and the plan was to achieve immortality, and through like technological means, and she just began devoting more and more time to her guy and this guy and the plan. And all of a sudden she stopped talking to her friends. She stopped talking. She kind of started cutting off ties with her family. She still lived partially at home at this time. And she was going to go live with this guy. And I met her partway through this whole transition aspect of it. And when she would talk about it, as in, like, you just don't understand. She seemed to be almost like pleading with me to kind of get it, to understand it, to be a part of it, to want to join it, and to be with them. And it turns out later, she left this group, this guy. Turns out he was part of a group, and he was part of a human trafficking group. And this kind of...
And this was totally online. She didn't meet up with any of them.
She never met them.
Okay.
They would like video chat.
But she displayed cult-like behavior.
Yeah, and he was a very manipulative kind of leader, one might call it. And it's really interesting because she's kind of she's very strong-willed. She's very smart, but it was this ability for someone to figure out what exactly was about that person and just pluck it out and say, okay, you need this. That's what you really, really find good about yourself, and I'm gonna be the only thing that's gonna be able to give it to you. They create that need for a certain type of attention, and then create themselves as the only one who will give you that kind of attention. And
but you said, I don't know if you're comfortable with sharing or if it's something that she would be okay with you sharing, but you said that she had gone through some things that might have prompted her to need that kind of group, that kind of validation.
She had a rough family upbringing. Parents weren't the nicest group of people.
But she said she had kind of like a medical...
Yeah, she suffers from kind of a slight social disability. And so she is...
But her need to actually upload her consciousness into the internet,
it wasn't a lot of face-to-face interaction that interested her. And it was kind of this more cerebral idea, because she was grasped by just the enormity of... I mean, we could go into like this technocratic area, but she wanted to live forever.
Yeah.
And this guy was gonna help her do that. And it's a shame because she's felt so lost, and so confused, but also angry and hurt and happy. And everything. It turned her into a bizarre person.
That kind of reminds me of a point that I like to make when I speak about cults or control groups or any kind of religion. I don't think that human beings are primarily rational creatures. I think that we are led by our emotions, and we are brought to rationality after we've thought it through with our emotions. We have a certain way that our emotions want to go, and then later we go back and we rationalize why we believe something or feel something.
Yeah.
It's actually not natural for human beings to try to rationalize first and then go about trying to bring their emotions to their rational, conclusions.
Yeah, we're living with caveman genes, so it's there is a disconnect in between what environment best suits us and what environment we have now.
Yeah, and we truly do have that kind of backwards way of dealing with things. So it's very easy to see why someone would get involved in a cult that proposes that they would fulfill all those needs. And then go back and be able to really easily rationalize away all the negative signs that they see. And I actually wanted to go back to the list that I was rattling off earlier and just go over one or two more of these telltale signs of cults, and just talk about how how that kind of ties into like the workplace cults that you were looking up. For instance, have you seen, like with your research on workplace cults, the kind of us versus them mentality? Because that's something that is a little bit more of a shaky thing when it comes to cults. Like a lot of cults kind of disguise that us versus them mentality.
The articles that I read about, the workplace cults weren't necessarily this big us against them. It was a very let's try to bring them to us, because it was the only reason.
Which can be the us versus them mentality.
But it wasn't the way people who
there is them and then there is us.
Yeah, the Catholics, because it was a Catholic website that published this article, and so the majority of their interviewees were Catholics, and so they felt like it was an us. It wasn't aggressive towards them like spiritually, but it was very. That's not what you do. It was that weird guy in the corner is acting weird. He wants us to join them. Let's not. And because it sort of, maybe it's because they were Catholics and they're huge. It's a huge group around the world, and
so
they
the
felt
group
that
itself
they had
was
more
a Catholic
power.
organization that was cult-like.
No. I'm sorry. I probably described this wrong.
Yeah.
This company was set up and had these dedicated seminars, and what ended up happening was these Catholic women decided to sue the company on grounds of workplace. It was something
discrimination.
Like not quite discrimination.
Sexism.
It was just like assault. Because
they were being assaulted.
I'm trying to remember the legalese they used, but it was the sense of they were violating ethical workplace codes, and so they complained that all this religious stuff was going around in their workplace, and they were being forced to do it. And so they sued, and the story just happened. So unfortunately, I don't have the result of the suit.
So this is what you were talking about before, where the workplace decided that they were going to force you to pray or do some chants or things like that beforehand.
And it was multiple times a day. It was you'd go to these you'd go to this like room, and there'd be a bunch of people in the rooms, and you'd sit in a circle and you'd say prayers and you'd chant songs and you'd burn incense to cleanse away sin.
I think that us versus them mentality, the way that it's said when you say us versus them, implies that you have an adversarial relationship with the outside world. Wherein, when I hear us versus them in consideration of cults, I'm thinking more along the lines of a cult gives you a sense of us and them. And there's
Okay.
a disconnect between,
Yeah.
like your friend, for instance, your ex-girlfriend who was involved in this cult that ended up being a human trafficking ring. You know, in order to describe what was happening, she couldn't describe to you what it was like to be in the cult unless you were a part of it.
Yeah.
It's impossible. Like Christians all the time say something along the lines of like, you can't understand, you know, grace. You can't understand these things unless you've subscribed to it, unless you believe it. And
Yeah.
it's the same kind of mentality, but extreme, where not only can't you describe, you know, your experiences with this organization, but you also have this.
It necessitates experience.
It necessitates experience, but it also necessitates a wall. You know what I mean? Like
Okay.
you're protecting yourself against like the outside. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like we weren't
it makes
supposed
sense.
to, for instance, have friends with like really deep friendships with people who were
Because they
outside
could-
of the church. It wasn't a spoken rule, but it was an unspoken rule where if you spent too much time outside of the church with people outside of the church or a group outside of the church, you were not devoting your time to God.
Wisely. Okay.
You weren't, yeah, that's kind of how it would be portrayed. Like, you know, you want to be wise in the friendships that you have because you don't want to have a friendship that's going to lead you away from God.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with relationships. Like it was never said, for instance, that you cannot be a Christian and have a relationship with someone outside of the church. But I guarantee you, if anybody ever decided to have a relationship outside of the church, which would be kind of crazy anyway, because relationships were kind of decided upon by disciplers. Like, legitimately, this is how it happened. So there was this guy who liked me, and I wasn't interested at all, but because I had close guy friendships and it can come off a certain way, he thought I loved him. And so he was in a different campus ministry at a different church, and so he called my discipler. No, his discipler called my discipler to ask if I was interested. So my discipler asked me if I was interested, and I said no. She gave me this lecture about how, you know, because I told her I probably don't want to ever get into a relationship. I would prefer to be unmarried because I had this idea that relationships inside the church, you had to do certain things. You know, I just didn't want to be involved in a relationship. So she gave me this long lecture about like relationships and how you were supposed to be in a relationship one day, and only a few people can have the gift of Paul where you don't have a relationship and get married. But that's how it worked, where she had to convey the message to his discipler and he conveyed the message to him. And that's how relationships started. And then he could have a date with me where he asked me to be his girlfriend. And that was a big deal. Like legitimately, it was like being engaged. Everyone, just 50 people on your Facebook page saying, "Oh my goodness, I knew this was going to happen. Congratulations." It was really, really creepy.
The whole lovey-dovey relationship thing can come off as a little creepy sometimes.
No kissing,
Oh,
ever.
really?
And holding hands is a big deal.
Interesting.
Just like we started holding hands.
Fascinating.
But at any rate, so there was never the allowance or the room to have a relationship legitimately with someone outside the church.
Yeah, because they were afraid they'd wear away at the programming.
Yeah, like my boyfriend asked me just the other day, he said, "Oh, like if you decided to go back to that church, like if I decided to go to that church, would you stay in a relationship with me?" And I said, "You have no idea, I couldn't. If you decided to be a part of that church, there would be such a divide between us that it would legitimately not be able to happen." That's the kind of wall that is between someone who's in a church and in a cult and outside of a cult, you know. And that's why I like to say there's varying levels, because there's kind of that mentality between Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah.
When my friend decided to date she's Protestant family, decided to date a Catholic, my mom came to me and she said, "You know, she's dating a Catholic. You might want to talk to her about that." And in my head, I was just like, y'all going to hell because, you know.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's funny because I mean my mother's a Protestant, my father's a Catholic.
Yeah.
Was where whatever terms you want to use with those. And there was nothing. There was no problem with it. And so whenever I hear the Protestant Catholic thing, I always kind of laugh.
One thing though that I think is interesting, and the reason why I wanted to talk about the scale of cult-like behavior, is that in my opinion, especially now as a skeptic and an atheist, all religions are either close to being a cult because of the amount of control they have over people's lives, or have every potential to become a cult.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why it's so difficult to determine the difference between a cult and not a cult.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you believe something enough, you can very easily be manipulated into acting upon it. That's why, for instance, when people talk about, you know, people who use Islam for terrorism, you know, they use that as a justification. You know, I know that there's different types of religion that can come out of one book, but I think that, you know, radical terrorists, you know, radical like Muslims are cherry picking things just as like really nice, kind Muslims are.
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, I understand what it's like to really believe something, to be so heavily believing something that you would go that far to do it. That's why I can get so scared about that kind of any religion who has a certain amount of hold over people, because for me, I know that if my church had told me that that was a legitimate action to take based off of my scriptures, I would have done it based on my church's teachings.
Oh wow.
And that's one reason why I think it's so hard to kind of know, you know,
exactly, and
whether something's a cult or not.
Mm-hmm. And so I like that idea you started out with when you're talking about a sliding scale.
That's why I like to call it a control group, because there's more controlling groups and less controlling groups.
Exactly. You can have like the Anglican Church, and then you can have somewhere like the Jonestown group. And so how do you kind of rationalize the idea, how do you get around the idea that these things are out there and will,
like the fear of it being out there.
Yeah, the fear that it's out there and controlling people. And
I just try to educate people. I tell people my story. I'm very open about my experience with the cult, and I think that anybody who has been involved in one really should be open about it.
Yeah.
I know that you're going to get a lot of experience with people saying things about you in particular. If you speak out, for instance, in an open way, the group that you've been a part of will come after you and will use justifications that they use to justify their own, group. But I think that it's always a good thing to speak out about your experience with a cult. And I honestly, truly believe that you can do so much for other people, and that's how I deal with it. Yeah. I let people know exactly what my experience has been, and what they can do about it for themselves. So.
Yeah, thank you. That almost wraps it up.
Yep, that almost wraps it up. Again, this was Road to Reason, a Skeptic's Guide to the 21st Century. I was your host, Kayla Turzak, and this was Brendan McClough.
Brendan McAuliffe.
McClough. And you can always watch us on Ustreams Sundays at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Channel 36 if you live in the Fairfax area. All of our shows are on YouTube. And you can always visit us on our Facebook page.
Make sure to like and comment.